Okay, so we are now at the point where we're going to start talking about routing and how to navigate around our application. So at the moment we have built out pretty much all of the functionality that we need to render our list of donuts. We can click on a donut, we can create a new one, you name it. But at the moment we have no way of tying all these things together. Now I've left this deliberately till last because routing isn't completely necessary at the beginning for us to actually understand things like module and component architecture, Angular's directives, services and state management, and also our forms. If we were to introduce routing at the beginning, I think it would overcomplicate things and we'll introduce too many things at once. The great thing about routing is that we can simply sprinkle it on top of our application, hook everything together, and it's all going to work perfectly. So essentially what we want to set up is our routing module. So first, if we jump into our app module, this is the root core module of where everything is happening. We've got our first ng module, our browser module, our app component, which is our entry component to bootstrapping our Angular application. We then have our admin module, which is our feature module. And our admin module is where we've built out all of our functionality. So to actually get our routing up and running, we need to first create a routing definition for our app module, because this is the root of our application. And we also need to then create some routing definitions for our admin module. So think of it this way. Any features that we like to create, such as our admin, which then contains all of our components that we built, is probably going to have its own routing module. Similarly, if we have an authentication module, it's going to probably have login, password reset, and the ability to sign up. So these kind of big chunks of features and modules tend to have their own routing definitions built in. So it's up to us to do two things. Is first, register the router module. So if we jump up to the top, we can say import the router module. And this comes from @angular/router. We want to then take our router module, and hopefully you can guess where it goes by now. It goes inside of our imports. Now what I like to do is have the Angular modules imported first, followed by any of our custom modules that we like to create. So what that means is I'm going to add our router module in here. Now if we save this out, not a lot is going to happen. We've essentially registered our router module, but there is something else that we need to do. Now because we are using this in the root of our application, we need to look at this method called forRoot. So we have forChild, which we'll talk about momentarily, but forRoot is essentially for the root of our application. Now this is a convention that I like to use. The Angular CLI by default likes to generate its own routing module. I really don't see the benefit of doing so, so I like to keep things nice and contained. It might be if you have a big routing definition file that you want to create, for example, app.routing.ts, and just simply export an array. But as we are importing things such as our modules, and this is the key point where we're then tying things together, I like to create these roots here. So here we're going to say export const roots, and this is going to be an array of our root definitions. Now we're using the export keyword in case we want to grab our roots from elsewhere. Otherwise, we're just going to simply reference our root and pass it in. So what is this roots array before we even start talking about how to do any routing? The roots array is a way that we can specify the kind of roots that we want. Now, if we hover over our type definitions, we have never array, which means we probably want to add a type to it. So if you add colon and then roots with a capital and hit enter, this is then going to import this roots type from the Angular router package. Now, if we command click and have a look through this, you can see that the type of roots is simply an alias for a root array. So what does a root look like? We have things such as path, the path to match against. We have path match, the component that we want to load, whether we want to redirect, any outlets that we want to specify. And we have more complex advanced features such as can activate, deactivate, load, data resolve, children, load children, and a few other bits and pieces. So these are things that we're going to come onto in the advanced course. However, I'm going to teach you more than enough to get started with Angular at the moment, which will involve a good handful of those properties available to us on the roots. So what we essentially want to do is pass in an object. And if we don't use this route type, we're not going to see any auto-completion like our path here. So we can say path, and then we essentially want to specify the route. So if we have an empty path, we then want to specify the component that we then want to render. So an empty path by default is then going to just simply match our localhost 4200. So it's up to us at this point to then say what component we want to then render. Now we have our admin module, but we're not actually rendering any of the components with the router. At the moment we have our app component, which simply specifies the component that we want to load. So we're going to change this out momentarily, but first we can temporarily import our donut list component. We can then hit enter. This comes from our .admin. So the current directory, admin, containers, donut list component. Now because we have registered our admin module and our admin module also exports our donut list and the single, this is going to work straight out of the box. So we can take our donut list, add it to our root definitions, hit save. Nothing's going to happen at the moment because we need to jump into that app component. And we need to change over our donut-single to what's called a router outlet. So if we say router-outlet, this is a directive from Angular, which allows us to specify where we want our components to be loaded inside of our application. So this app component is generally a nice small container which has common things such as a header, footer perhaps, and this outlet is essentially an injection slot where the router is then going to inject more of our components. So let's save this out and have a look. So you can see we have our donut list, which has then been rendered. We can inspect element, and I'm just going to show you a few things inside of here. You can see that if we jump into our app div, we have the header, which is our header up here, the router outlet, and you can see that router outlet directive. Now what happens is Angular injects the component underneath that router outlet, depending on the URL. So at this point, it's fully within our capabilities to make these routes dynamic, so Angular can then render them out for us. So let's go ahead and create another route. Let's say path, and here we're going to just say donut. We can then say component is going to be the donut single component. We can then hit save. Now we have our list of items. We want to manually change the URL. So we can go to /donut. We then have our second component being rendered dynamically. Now if we hit back and forward, you can see that the router is now swapping based on the URL, that particular component. So what we essentially want to learn is how to then click on these, make an update, save things, and then programmatically redirect back to anywhere that we like. So this is a quick getting started on Angular's router. We've talked about this router module, this for route, specifying a routes array. We've also looked at creating the paths and rendering a particular component based on the URL. And throughout the rest of this chapter, we're going to take a domain-driven feature approach. So for now, I think we've done enough. We've then talked about the router outlet, and there's so much more to come in the next few lessons as we explore how to hook everything together to get a fully functional application.